It is evident to me that men and their unique struggles continue to go ignored by the broader society, and they are instead sacrificed on the altar of so-called caring about women or caring about the advancement of the other gender. And while I think this has caused a lot of tension in the West, and it has certainly given rise to people like Andrew Tate and the manosphere, who are temperamentally and philosophically different from me, there's something to be said about the extent of this abuse and this ignorance of what a lot of men are going through right now. And there's something to be said about the rage and anger at this ignorance and this dismissiveness that so many people have towards men and their issues. It's something to be said about that and what that implies for the future of society. In a recent segment that the BBC ran between commentators, once two feminists and two, I don't want to say men's rights, but two men who were conscious of the problems that men go through, kind of underlies the dismissiveness that so many people, especially feminists, have towards men and their issues. And there are two moments in this segment that I think is particularly consequential. Now, I should say, this segment got Lawrence Fox, a British commentator, in trouble because he then went on GB News, which is a British sort of conservative news station, and he made a comment about one of the commentators in the segment that was seen as crass and rude and not in good taste. And while the coverage in Britain was all crazy and British conservative media had a meltdown, very few folks actually focused on the context of Lawrence Fox's comments. And it's very easy for the modern mind, which has been so weakened and dulled by the digital age, so weakened and dulled by 60-second hot takes, unable to actually persist in sound thinking, to jump at the first thing that sticks out to us about what someone says, as opposed to actually thinking through the implications of their argument. And hopefully in this video we'll do more of the latter and none of the former. So let's actually look at the two instances I mentioned of this clip that I think kind of underlie the dismissiveness that happens in the West towards men's issues. Here is the individual in the clip talking about how he thinks that whenever men's issues are brought up, they are dismissed, and then the commentator next to him immediately goes on to dismiss those issues and say, well, they are this way because of women. Go.
I mean, literally, the biggest killer of men under 50 is suicide. That is an arresting statistic, and if that doesn't warrant specific attention, mental health is an umbrella issue.
I have to say that is also because women are unsuccessful. That is a lot of feeds into that statistic.
But it feels like, it just doesn't feel like you've got any space for this idea that men might have unique challenges that face them. And the problem is, even as I'm saying this, in my mind, it's like I've got out the violin and I don't want to be.
Read the book.
I don't want to be this guy, because that's part of the problem. Is because you're encouraged on one level is men need to talk about their problems more, and then the moment you do it, you're like, all right, but not quite so often and not quite so loud. So like you say, the book is more light-hearted than that, but it certainly, goes around these issues.
Now, it's very easy. It's very easy to see how weird this is if you're not indoctrinated by the line of second and third wave feminism. See, the second wave feminists basically began with the idea that the personal is political, that everything that occurs in the private realm of society actually has implications for the broader society and should be acted towards and seen in that light. And what they really also meant is that everything that occurs in the household is fundamentally a reflection of the patriarchy, and the patriarchy, according to this line of thought, is actually derivative of a power imbalance, and that power imbalance is political. So women need to go ahead and retake the family, retake the home, and proclaim victory over this force that so-called holds them back. And the commentator who responded to this individual, this man, actually reflects the flaws and the rotten fruit of that thinking better than anyone else I've seen on a TV show in a very long while, because he's basically saying that men have problems, and those problems are downstream of women having problems. So she's completely and utterly ignoring the significance of the male suicidality problem, of the male loneliness problem, of which many commentators like Shuon Head and others have talked about. And she's saying that women should have instead be put above the considerations of men for XYZ reason, because she's reasoning from a premise that's fundamentally flawed, and I'll actually get into that in a second. Also, I dislike how these issues are talked about. I think these issues ultimately muddy the waters. Ultimately, when you reason by means of averages and statistics, as opposed to finding the broader ideas that the statistics would implicate, you tend to get into waters that you don't really understand. So when we talk about a women's issue or a men's issue, we're really talking about things reflected in statistics. But these may not have anything to do per se with inherent to being a male or being a female. These may simply be issues of the human condition that a particular group of people are happening to experience right now. But when you box these issues into being a male problem or a female problem, you actually miss the sort of universal nature of the human condition. Human beings feel. Human beings have issues. Human beings go through struggles. And if we didn't solely view these things in terms of sex, but in terms of us being human, I think that would be the unifying solution that would, I think, usurp the false feminist idea that in this constant power struggle between the sexes, women's issues always matter more than men's issues. If we just understood that you shouldn't define yourself by your sex, but instead by your humanity, then maybe we would see these as human issues and we'll be able to work towards a much better dialogue as opposed to simply having this power clash between men and women in terms of who issues matter. No one's suffering is greater than another person's suffering. No sound system of ethics will degrade another human being solely on the basis of the perceived advantage they have by virtue of their identity and put them above someone else or below someone else and say, your issues matter more. That's not how we actually conduct sound thinking. That's not how we actually understand the human condition. That's how we get involved in an illusory power fight constructed by philosophers who are fundamentally disconnected from reality. Now let's go on to this other commentator who also made a similar point to the one we just saw about men's issues, women's issues go.
That we have to change the fact that women still earn 15% less than men.
But no one's saying you can't do both.
No, exactly.
We can multitask.
Exactly. I agree.
Can you multitask?
Well, not me personally, obviously, but I'm saying that. But I don't think that those are reasons to not address these problems.
No, I agree.
Francis.
But most women experience sexual harassment.
I totally accept that. I don't understand what it's happening again with this conversation where I'm talking about the specific issues that men face, and you're quoting other issues which I do not contest on any level.
Here's a proposal.
I'm seeming very chippy now, aren't I? I didn't expect
Why don't
to.
you launch BASH? Blokes Against Sexual Harassment.
Well, I'm totally against sexual harassment, of course I am.
But do something to support women, stand by women who are facing that in the way that women stand by men. You stand by women, and I think we could.
Well, it's I do think this discussion has already been interesting. I've mentioned the suicide stat several times, and we've ended up discussing other things which are completely valid, certainly in terms of my industry, and I understand why those discussions are live discussions. But the idea that we can't have both those discussions, I genuinely find that odd,
Nobody
Francis.
said we couldn't.
So you see there, she proposes creating a group called Blokes Against Sexual Harassment. And she does this in place of actually engaging with the male commentator in his discussion about male suicidality. Again, this is another reflection of the idea that certain groups matter more and their issues matter more compared to other groups who have a perceived advantage. And really, I want to really get into this viewpoint. The folly of the feminist argument in this case, saying that what women go through matters more than what men go through, is that it actually doesn't see women for who they are. It sees women as faceless members of this broad, amorphous, abstract category called women, which is then viewed in the terms of the history of society and the history of the world, as opposed to being viewed as individuals with their own unique situations and their unique problems and their unique abilities. See, when you say that X is a women issue or Y is a women's issue, that then gives you the ability to make so many absurd, incoherent statements that if you actually apply it to the individual level, wouldn't possibly be made by a rational person. I'm not saying that you can't analyze issues on the level of the group. As I mentioned, statistics, in order to be coherent, in order to have some kind of heft to them, have to look at the group on a broader level and say, okay, this is what's happening as a baseline. But you never stay there. The problem with the feminists is that they universally saw women as having a condition of oppression, and they universally saw men as being a part of that condition of oppression, and then they pitted both of the groups in the abstract against each other, which has created so much confusion, so much hatred, and so much brokenness, which has now materialized into the example of the manosphere. It's materialized into the sort of war between the sexes, as it's so called. It's materialized into so many things that don't help social relations and only worsen them, because we begin with the abstract and that trickles out of the individual, as opposed to us being prudent and beginning with the individual and going towards the abstract, if we even go there at all. See, there can be no ethical system built on the abstract group, because groups don't do things, individuals do things. So as I mentioned, if we didn't view certain issues as women's issues or certain issues as men's issues in this particular context, obviously, if you're talking health-wise or biological-wise, there are issues that women go through that men do not. Men don't menstruate, no matter what anyone tells you. Women menstruate. Wait, men don't bear children. Women don't bear children. So if you're talking about women's issues on the biological level, okay, that's an objective conversation that we can have that actually talks about individual facts that are verified in reality. But if you're talking about men's issues and women's issues in terms of social engagement, in terms of work, in terms of suffering, all kind of stuff, then you muddy the conversation, as I mentioned before, and that makes any fruitful dialogue very difficult, because it then implies, and this is the other issue of the feminist perspective, the feminist perspective implies that the lived experience of women experiencing these issues is always going to triumph the opinions of anyone else, especially other men. And when you degrade the conversation from a sort of empirical, objective outlook on issues to a more personal and lived experience take on issues that can be talked about in all kind of ways that don't justify a proposition, but merely assume a proposition and then assume the conclusion, i.e. circular reasoning, then you can essentially make whatever absurd argument you want to make. And you can then ignore the suicidality amongst men by saying, oh, well, women suffer too. Women have issues too. Women have gone through a lot too. As I said, suffering is not a numerical game. You don't win a prize for having suffered more than someone else. Suffering is inherent to the human condition. I don't believe, as some have said, that life is suffering. I don't believe that. I think life is struggle. Life is tension between where you are now and where you wish to be in the future. In other words, life is the tension between where you are right now and where your potential could take you. Life is all about, in one sense, achieving higher potential and living in accordance with the right, the ethical norm of the right. What is good? What is just? What is proper? What is orderly? That's what a lot of life is about. It's not about having a struggle and then proclaiming your struggle to be more important than someone else's struggle, and then flavoring that struggle by applying it to a certain sex or a certain gender or a certain group that you believe has had it worse. Life is not a matter of living by someone's opinion. Life is a matter about living by the truth. But when you have these conversations that say, well, women do this more, men do this more, you can't find the truth because you're coloring the conversation through the subjective realm of how individual people or how particular people experience life. And that's not a sound basis for any further inquiry. That just muddies the waters and makes things more emotional. I must say also that second wave feminism and the idea that the personal is political and that women should view men as part of this indistinguishable patriarchy as opposed to viewing men as individual human beings is basically a kind of human sacrifice, because it basically says that the patriarchy being evil and a lot of men partaking in the patriarchy are then consequently evil. You can therefore put the goals and desires, so to speak, of women in that same frame over them because it's justified in the name of benevolence, which would then lead someone to ignore the problem of male suicide and basically say, well, women's issues are more important, or women's issues are more consequential, which is what the commentators in this video did. This is human sacrifice, because you are discounting the lives of individual human beings who happen to have a certain sex or gender on the basis of your preconceived notion about most people in that group. And by doing that, you're essentially saying their life does not matter, their life is meaningless, and you are engaging in a sort of act of dismissiveness, not just to their positions, but to them. And in my opinion, no moral society can permit human sacrifice to continue, whether it be metaphorical, as I'm using it right now, or whether it be literal. And I think that that's one of the reasons why there's so much tension between men and women, is because the conversation is phrased on erroneous grounds that discount the real human beings behind the terms and phrases. But also, there's a broader ethical phenomenon happening here. When you begin with the group, as I mentioned before, and you assess the condition of people on the basis of their group, i.e. how black people are doing on the basis of someone being black, how black people are doing, someone being women, how women are doing, then what you're also doing is you're engaging in an ethical idea, a dangerous idea that says, that you can judge some things being good or some things being bad on the basis of how many people those particular things impact. For example, one of the things said in the conversation was that during the pandemic, women had to work overtime as nurses, because it's true, women happen to be nurses more than men. They had to work overtime to care for people. Therefore, men's issues don't matter. You're essentially saying because they were doing certain things in a more majority, in a way that is bigger than men were, that makes them somehow valuable as a human being. This is a form of what we call utilitarianism, that the greatest number somehow produces the greatest effect, which we can then use as a measure of value. But that's not true if we go back to the individual human and we consider the human condition. The greatest number does not produce the greatest value. The greatest number does not produce the most moral response. The greatest number simply tells you how many people are doing something and nothing more, nothing less. It doesn't matter if men were doing nothing during the pandemic, which is not true. Many men were working, but let's say they were doing nothing. That doesn't discount their suffering, because suffering is not measured on a group basis. Suffering is measured on how you as an individual human being interact with it. And this is what I have to finally say. Far too many of us in this society have this temptation to simply label people in these abstract categories and not consider the person behind these abstract categories. That's why a lot of men are suffering. A lot of men are suffering because they are being grouped in with the male sex as a whole, and they are then being dismissed on that basis as opposed to being seen as a person, living, breathing, experiencing person that actually has value and has experiences that are worth something. And I think that if we're going to move ahead as a society and we're going to fix the sort of war between the sexes, so to speak, we're not going to take the Andrew Tate approach and be domineering and aggressive and mean and rude and immoral. And we're not going to take the feminist approach and be misandrous, people who hate men and who view them in the terms of the collective. We're going to take the most moral approach, which is to see people as individuals, made in the image of something greater than themselves, capable of reason, and who have their own unique struggles and their own unique passions. And then we proceed from that point in having a discussion about sex and gender. And I promise you, because the premise is more sound, the conclusion will be more sound than what we are getting right now, which is just noise, chaos, and war. Let's end the war by reverting to reason and by ignoring the flawed thinking that has gotten us into the mess in the first place. My friends, if you want to help me get my message out there, like this video, comment on this video, share this video. Be sure to donate to me, my PayPal, my locals. I have so many places where you can contribute. Share this video. Please help me get things out there. I love you guys so much, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.